Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Alabama Black Belt. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the late spring of 1882, a sealed shipment arrived at a private estate deep within the Alabama Black Belt, a region already known at the time for its isolation and discretion. County freight records describe the cargo only as a large exotic animal, female, transported inland from the port of Mobile under special instruction. The delivery was made at night, the wagon covered, its handlers sworn to silence. Those early records, sparse as they are, align with what later historians would describe about the Black Belt itself: fertile, wealthy land paired with a culture of deliberate privacy. What occurred there rarely traveled beyond its boundaries unless it was forced to. The animal was a gorilla, fully grown, unusually large, and as later veterinary notes would quietly reveal, already pregnant at the time of purchase. This detail did not appear in the original bill of sale. Whether it was overlooked or intentionally concealed remains unclear. What is certain is that the buyer, a reclusive landowner named Edwin Harrowell, had not anticipated it. Harrowell's estate sat miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woodland and low clay fields. Neighbors described him as educated, controlled, and deeply curious. He had previously imported foreign plants and mechanical instruments, none of which raised concern. The gorilla was different. From the moment of arrival, it required a reinforced enclosure hastily constructed behind the main house, using iron fittings ordered within days of delivery. At first, the animal's behavior was described as subdued. A farm journal kept by one of Harrowell's overseers notes that the gorilla ate little, moved slowly, and spent long periods sitting with its back to the enclosure wall. "She watches," the man wrote. "Not us, something else." Within weeks, concern shifted to frustration. Harrowell consulted a local physician and later, a traveling veterinary specialist whose name appears only once in county correspondence. What followed is recorded indirectly, through supply orders for syringes, tonics, and chemical compounds described vaguely as stimulants. No dosage instructions survive. According to later testimony, these injections were intended to calm the animal, to regulate what Harrowell believed was abnormal lethargy. Instead, the opposite occurred. By midsummer, the gorilla's temperament changed. She became restless, aggressive, striking the enclosure walls with increasing force. Workers refused to approach her. Several quit without explanation. The Alabama Black Belt had seen its share of troubling ventures, but this was something new. The injections continued. The animal grew more volatile, and beneath it all, unseen but progressing, was a pregnancy being pushed toward a breaking point. What arrived in secrecy had begun to unravel control. By early summer, the changes in the gorilla were no longer subtle. Her appetite returned abruptly, but with it came violent swings in behavior. County purchase logs show increased orders of raw meat, far beyond what had been estimated at the time of sale. At the same time, Harrowell continued ordering chemical tonics and injectable compounds, some labeled as nerve stimulants, others left unnamed. No formal treatment plan exists, only repetition. Workers later testified that the gorilla began pacing for hours, tracing the same path along the enclosure wall until the ground beneath her feet turned to mud. When approached, she bared her teeth and struck the iron bars with such force that the sound carried across the fields. One farmhand described it as metal screaming back. It was during this period that the pregnancy became apparent. A short note added in the margin of a veterinary ledger reads, "Abdominal swelling, not illness. Condition advanced." The note is unsigned. There is no evidence Harrowell altered his approach after this realization. If anything, the injections increased. The Alabama black belt's isolation once again played a role. No regulatory authority existed to oversee such treatment. The estate was private. The animal was foreign, and the responsibility rested entirely with a man whose curiosity had already overridden caution. By July, the gorilla's sleep patterns collapsed. She screamed at night, deep, echoing cries that locals later said did not sound entirely animal. Neighbors reported livestock breaking free, horses refusing stables, dogs howling until dawn. Church records show multiple absences attributed to unsettled conditions east of the river. One evening, an overseer named Samuel Reed approached the enclosure against orders. His account survives only through a later affidavit. He claimed the gorilla pressed her hands against her abdomen repeatedly, then struck the ground as if in pain. When Reed stepped closer, she lunged, bending one of the iron bars inward. He fled. He never returned to the estate. By late July, Harrowell ordered the enclosure reinforced again. Heavy chains were added. The injections continued daily. Witnesses later claimed the gorilla resisted violently, requiring multiple men to restrain her. One wrote, "She learned our movements. She waited." What Harrowell failed to recognize or chose to ignore was that the animal's condition had moved beyond agitation. The pregnancy was destabilizing. The treatments were accelerating it, and the enclosure designed for containment had become a pressure chamber. In the Alabama Black Belt, storms often built quietly before breaking. This one was no different. The first signs of imminent collapse appeared not in the enclosure, but in the town nearest the estate. In August of 1882, a local doctor reported an unusual request from Edwin Harrowell, instruments typically reserved for human childbirth. The request was refused. The doctor later stated that Harrowell appeared distracted, unwell, and unwilling to explain. It was the last time Harrowell sought outside counsel. Back at the estate, the gorilla's condition deteriorated rapidly. Farm logs from that month note prolonged periods of stillness followed by sudden violent outbursts. She struck the ground, the walls, herself. The injections continued, sometimes administered twice a day. No one recorded the dosages, only that the animal became increasingly unpredictable. On the night of August 21st, witnesses reported hearing a sound unlike anything before. It was not a roar but a sustained cry, low and strained, carrying across the fields and into the woods. Several townspeople later said it lasted more than an hour. Horses bolted. Windows rattled. No one went toward the estate. According to a later reconstruction of events, this was the onset of premature labor. By dawn, the enclosure showed signs of damage. Chains lay twisted. One iron support had torn free from its mounting. Blood was visible along the packed earth inside, not in great quantity but enough to alarm those who saw it. The gorilla was still inside, breathing heavily, her movements erratic. What followed is pieced together from fragments. A torn page from a farm journal, a constable's note, and testimony given years later. At some point during the morning, the gorilla broke free. Whether it was through sheer force or structural failure remains unclear. The enclosure collapsed inward and she escaped into the surrounding fields. Her condition at the time made her movements unpredictable. She ran, then stopped. She turned toward the road leading to town. Midday, the first alarm was raised. Livestock were found killed or scattered. Fences were torn down. A wagon was overturned on the main path. People fled indoors. Church bells rang not for worship but warning. The gorilla reached the outskirts of town by afternoon. She was injured, disoriented, and in the midst of premature delivery. And the Alabama black belt, unprepared and isolated, was about to face the consequences of what had been done in secrecy. When the gorilla entered the town limits, panic spread faster than any official response could form. This was not a place accustomed to sudden threats. The Alabama Black Belt's towns were small, orderly, and built on routine. What approached them that afternoon did not fit into any category they understood. Eyewitness accounts describe the gorilla moving unevenly, sometimes on all fours, sometimes upright, clutching her abdomen as she crossed through open ground. She did not attack indiscriminately. Instead, she reacted to noise, to movement, to people who ran too quickly or came too close. A delivery wagon was struck and overturned when its driver tried to flee. A storefront window shattered after she slammed into the wooden frame, startled by shouting from inside. The damage was chaotic but brief. Chickens scattered. A mule broke loose and ran until it collapsed. Several homes were damaged along the edge of town, doors torn from hinges, fences reduced to splinters. Yet there are no verified records of deaths during the initial encounter. What dominated the testimonies was fear, not loss of life. At some point near the town's northern edge, the gorilla collapsed. Witnesses described her sitting heavily in the dirt, breathing in deep, shaking intervals. It was there, partially hidden by a stand of trees, that the premature delivery occurred. No official medical record exists. What is known comes from later testimony given by two men who watched from a distance. They stated that the infant did not survive. The gorilla remained beside it only briefly. When shouting drew closer, she rose suddenly, let out a cry described as broken, and fled toward the forest line beyond the fields. By the time a small group of armed men arrived, local constables and volunteers, the town was already quieting. The gorilla was gone. What remained were tracks leading north, broken branches, and a path of destruction that ended abruptly at the tree line. Search efforts were poorly coordinated. No one had experience tracking an animal of that size, especially one injured and enraged. Some argued she would die from her condition. Others feared she would return. Nightfall ended the pursuit. Back at the estate, officials discovered the extent of what had preceded the escape. The enclosure lay destroyed. Syringes and empty vials were scattered in a storage room. A ledger listing injection schedules ended days before the incident, its final note reading only, "Increase ineffective." Edwin Harrowell was nowhere to be found. By morning, the guerrillas' tracks had vanished into the dense woods, and with them went any remaining illusion of control. The morning after the escape brought an uneasy stillness to the town. Shops remained closed. Families gathered indoors, speaking in low voices. What had happened felt unreal, as if the events of the previous day might dissolve if left unexamined. But the evidence was everywhere: broken wood, torn earth, and tracks pressed deep into the clay roads before disappearing into the forest. A search party was assembled by mid-morning. It included constables, several farmers familiar with the woods, and a handful of men armed more out of fear than preparation. They followed the trail as far as it allowed, noting snapped saplings and bark stripped from trees at shoulder height. Blood appeared intermittently along the path, confirming the guerrillas' injuries. Still, the trail faded quickly once it entered denser growth. By early afternoon, the men halted. The forest ahead grew thick and uneven, with ravines and swampy ground that made further pursuit dangerous. One constable later testified that the woods had gone unnaturally quiet, birds absent, insects still. Against their better judgment, they turned back. Back in town, attention shifted to the estate. With Harrowell missing and the enclosure destroyed, county officials finally entered the property in force. What they found deepened concern. The storage room behind the main house contained dozens of empty vials, some unlabeled, others marked with abbreviations no one present could identify. Syringes lay in a wooden crate, several bent or broken. A physician called to examine the scene concluded only that the substances used were inappropriate for prolonged use on any animal, pregnant or otherwise. His written opinion ends cautiously. The condition observed would likely produce agitation, confusion, and extreme distress. As for the infant, it was buried quietly at the edge of town, without record or marker. No one wished to discuss it further. The guerrillas' actions were framed publicly as the result of mishandling, not malice. Privately, people questioned why the injections had continued even after the pregnancy was known. Edwin Harrowell's disappearance remained unexplained. Some believed he fled before authorities arrived. Others suggested he followed the guerrilla into the woods and never returned. No proof supported either claim. Days passed without further sightings, yet the sense of danger did not lift. Farmers reported finding crops trampled miles from the town. Hunters spoke of movement at dawn along the forest edge. Each report was investigated, then dismissed, but the pattern persisted. The Alabama Black Belt had absorbed the shock, but it had not released the threat. Somewhere beyond the fields, in a landscape shaped by secrecy and poor decisions, the guerrilla remained, injured, altered, and no longer confined. By the end of August, the search officially ceased. County authorities cited limited resources and increasing risk to civilians as reasons for suspending pursuit. Privately, several men involved admitted they no longer believed the guerrilla could be found easily. The woods north of town were dense, fractured by old ravines and stretches of swamp that even experienced hunters avoided. In the Alabama Black Belt, such terrain could swallow tracks within hours. Despite the official pause, sightings continued. A farmer reported his cornfield flattened overnight, the stalks pressed into the mud in a wide arc rather than trampled at random. Another claimed his smokehouse door had been torn free without signs of theft. Each incident was logged, then quietly set aside. No one wanted to be the one to say it aloud, but the pattern suggested the gorilla was still nearby and adapting. More troubling were the behavioral changes noted by those who encountered signs of her passage. Trees were not merely broken, but bent. Branches were twisted in ways that suggested testing rather than frenzy. One hunter remarked that it looked like something learning how strong it was. This detail appears in a later affidavit, recorded with visible hesitation. The injections, though left behind at the estate, had not simply faded from effect. According to the physician who reviewed the case, prolonged exposure to stimulants could leave lasting neurological changes, heightened aggression, distorted perception, irregular sleep. Combined with trauma and loss, the outcome was unpredictable. The gorilla that had fled into the forest was no longer the animal that had arrived months earlier. At night, sounds began drifting toward the outskirts of town. Low, resonant calls carried on humid air, stopping abruptly when lights appeared. Dogs refused to bark. Horses grew restless in their stalls. No one ventured out to investigate. Meanwhile, questions about Harrowell grew sharper. His accounts were frozen. His house stood unlocked, half-packed. In a desk drawer, officials found a loose page covered in repeated phrases, written in a shaking hand. She reacts faster now. She anticipates. The page ended with a single line underlined twice. The injections cannot be stopped. By September, the town existed in a state of restrained vigilance. Life resumed outwardly, but routines shifted. Children were kept indoors at dusk. Farmers worked in groups. Roads near the forest were avoided after dark. The gorilla did not return to town. She did not need to. Her presence was felt without being seen, pressing outward from the woods like a held breath. And in the Alabama Black Belt, where land remembered mistakes longer than people did, that was enough to keep everyone waiting. September brought no relief, only a slow normalization of fear. What had begun as panic settled into habit. People adjusted without discussion, the way communities often do when danger proves persistent but undefined. In the Alabama Black Belt, silence had always been a form of coordination. Reports from the surrounding countryside suggested the gorilla was moving deliberately. Damage no longer appeared random. Outbuildings were avoided. Livestock left untouched when doors were closed properly. Instead, the signs appeared where boundaries were weak: broken fence lines, unsecured sheds, isolated fields. One farmer remarked that it was like she learned where resistance ends. A constable named Henry Doyle compiled a private log during this period. It was never filed, but fragments survive through family papers. Doyle wrote of finding footprints near a creek bed, larger than any bear track he had seen, but arranged with unusual balance. Not fleeing, he noted, traveling. He estimated the direction as deeper into the forested high ground. At the same time, physical changes in the gorilla became apparent through indirect evidence. Blood traces ceased entirely. Whatever injuries she had sustained during the escape appeared to be healing. This suggested not only survival but recovery, an unsettling development given her altered state. One night, a group of men reported seeing movement at the edge of a clearing. They raised lanterns and caught sight of a tall, dark form standing briefly upright before retreating into the trees. No shots were fired. Later questioned as to why, one man said simply, "It didn't feel like a hunt anymore." Medical speculation continued quietly. The physician who had reviewed the estate warned that the injections, likely a mix of stimulants and sedatives, could produce heightened cognition alongside aggression. In lay terms, the animal may have become more aware, more reactive, and more capable of anticipating human behavior. His concerns were dismissed publicly but circulated privately. By late September, the gorilla's presence was no longer discussed openly. People stopped reporting sightings. Not because they ceased, but because they were expected. The forest became a boundary rather than a mystery. Edwin Harrowell remained missing. No trace of him was found in the woods or beyond. Some believed he had fled by river. Others whispered that he had followed what he had created, unable to abandon it. No evidence supported either theory. What remained was an unspoken understanding. The gorilla had not vanished. She had claimed territory. And as autumn settled over the Alabama Black Belt, the town learned to live beside something it could neither control nor remove. An outcome shaped not by nature alone, but by human interference carried too far. By October, the forest itself seemed altered. Hunters who had worked those woods for decades said the game had shifted away from the northern ridges entirely. Deer trails went unused. Birds nested farther south. Even insects thinned in certain areas, leaving stretches of unnatural quiet. These changes were noted not in official reports but in personal journals and letters, written without emphasis, as observations that felt too obvious to question. One such letter, sent by a schoolteacher to her sister, mentions a heaviness in the trees as though something listens before it moves. She adds that her walk home had become shorter not by distance but by decision. "I don't linger anymore," she wrote. The gorilla was seen again near the end of the month, just once and only briefly. A group of men repairing a washed-out fence claimed they saw her at dawn, partially obscured by fog. She stood at the edge of the trees, upright still. When one man raised his voice, she retreated silently. No charge followed, no aggression, only withdrawal. This restraint unsettled them more than violence would have. The Alabama Black Belt had always carried folklore shaped by caution rather than confrontation. Stories passed quietly, warnings embedded in routine. Now new ones formed. Parents told children not to wander north. Farmers left offerings of food far from their homes, hoping to redirect attention. These acts were never acknowledged publicly, but they occurred often enough to suggest shared belief. Medical discussion faded as well. The physician who had spoken out earlier stopped mentioning the case altogether. When asked years later why, he said only that whatever was altered could not be unaltered. His records from that period end abruptly. As autumn deepened, the gorilla's movements grew harder to track. Signs appeared, then vanished. Paths were used once and abandoned. It was as if she were learning the rhythms of the land, adjusting to human presence without challenging it directly. By November, the town had stopped waiting for resolution. Life resumed under new assumptions. The forest was no longer neutral ground. It was occupied. And somewhere within it moved a creature shaped by captivity, chemistry, and loss. no longer bound by iron or instruction, but carrying the consequences of both into the deeper reaches of the Alabama Black Belt. As winter approached, the signs of the gorilla's presence became less frequent but more deliberate. Snow was rare in the Alabama Black Belt, yet frost revealed what bare ground concealed. Tracks appeared along ridgelines rather than valleys, suggesting awareness of visibility and approach. They followed no straight path, bending around open spaces, keeping to cover. Whoever or whatever made them understood exposure. By December, reports shifted from damage to observation. People spoke of feeling watched while crossing fields at dawn. A woodcutter claimed he heard slow breathing behind him, close enough to feel, yet saw nothing when he turned. These accounts were shared quietly, often ending with the same phrase, "It didn't want to be seen." The gorilla's behavior suggested learning rather than rage. The aggression triggered by injections and trauma had not vanished, but it had changed form. Instead of striking outward, it seemed focused inward, measured. One hunter described the woods as feeling claimed, not threatened. He stopped hunting there entirely. That winter, a traveler passing through the region recorded a brief note in his journal, later recovered by a local historian. He wrote of being warned not to camp near a certain stretch of forest. When he asked why, the reply was simple: "Something there remembers us." Edwin Harrowell's fate remained unresolved. No sightings, no letters, no financial activity. His house decayed slowly, left untouched except by weather. Officials discussed declaring him dead in absentia, then quietly decided against it. Some absences, it seemed, were easier to leave undefined. By early 1883, the gorilla was no longer described as an escaped animal, but as a present. Children were taught boundaries without explanation. Routes changed. Even language shifted, referring to the deep woods rather than the forest itself. Nothing more was destroyed. No one was attacked, and yet the unease deepened. The injections had not only altered the gorilla's body but her relationship to people. She avoided them, studied them, and stayed just beyond reach. In the Alabama Black Belt, where land holds memory longer than records, that was enough. The forest was no longer empty. And what moved within it was no longer entirely wild, nor entirely shaped by human design. By the spring of 1883, the town had accepted a quiet truth. The gorilla was not leaving. She had not moved on, and she had not died. Instead, she had settled into the deeper forest, beyond regular paths and known clearings. What frightened people most was not her continued presence, but how well she seemed to understand distance, how close she could come without being seen, how far she needed to stay to remain untouched. Farmers working the outer fields began finding signs that suggested deliberate observation. Fresh impressions near fence posts, trees stripped of bark at eye level. In one case, a crude stack of stones arranged near a creek crossing, something no animal native to the region would have done. When shown to a constable, he dismissed it publicly, then advised the farmer to move his livestock south. Medical speculation resurfaced briefly when a visiting doctor reviewed the earlier injection records recovered from Harrowell's estate. He noted that prolonged exposure to stimulants, especially during pregnancy, could result in lasting neurological changes, heightened alertness, aggression paired with restraint, and distorted responses to threat. In his words, the animal may no longer respond as an animal would. His report was never filed. Around this time, the first rumors emerged suggesting the infant's loss had altered the gorilla's behavior more deeply than the chemicals alone. Witnesses claimed she lingered near the town's edge at night, not entering, not retreating, only watching. Mothers reported waking to silence where night sounds should have been. Dogs refused to leave porches after dark. No attacks followed, no confrontations. The restraint itself became the threat. Edwin Harrowell's estate was finally sealed by county order, though no investigation followed. Inside, officials found his final journal entry written days before the escape. She reacts before stimulus, anticipates pain, remembers. Below it, a final line scratched deeply into the page: I have taught her fear. By summer, the forest north of town had effectively become forbidden without any law declaring it so. People avoided it because avoidance worked. The gorilla did not cross into town again. She did not need to. The Alabama black belt adjusted as it always had, not by force, but by recognition. Something altered now occupied the land, and it was learning how to stay. As the second year since the escape unfolded, the gorilla's presence became woven into daily decisions rather than emergency response. People no longer spoke of her arrival or the chaos that followed. Instead, they spoke of where not to go and when not to stay out late. The forest north of town had acquired an unspoken schedule, avoided at dawn and dusk, respected without discussion. Occasionally, something surfaced that reminded everyone of how the situation had begun. In early 1884, a flood exposed part of the old estate grounds, washing away soil behind the collapsed enclosure. Buried beneath the clay were broken syringes, bent needles, and glass fragments clouded with residue. A constable ordered them reburied immediately. No report was filed. Those who saw the items later said the discovery explained more than it answered. Whatever had been injected into the gorilla had not simply altered her behavior in captivity. It had followed her into the wild, reshaping how she interacted with the world around her. She was no longer driven purely by instinct. She reacted with memory. Hunters noted that traps were sprung but never triggered. Bait was taken without disturbance. One man swore his rifle had been lifted from where he left it leaning against a tree, placed several feet away, untouched but unmistakably moved. He never hunted again. The Alabama black belt had always carried stories of creatures in the margins, things that watched, learned, and withdrew. But this story differed in one crucial way. Everyone knew where it began. It began with a purchase, with injections, with control imposed where understanding was absent. By late 1884, sightings grew rare, not because the gorilla had left, but because she had mastered concealment. Her movements left fewer signs. Her routes shifted constantly. The forest adapted around her. Edwin Harrowell was finally declared dead in absentia, though no cause or date was assigned. His estate was never reclaimed. It decayed where it stood, a quiet marker of responsibility abandoned. And still the gorilla remained. She did not attack. She did not return to town. She simply endured, carrying with her the imprint of human interference, chemical, emotional, and irreversible. In the Alabama black belt, that endurance became the final lesson. Some changes do not reverse. They migrate. They settle. and they wait unseen just beyond the places people choose to remember. By 1885, the story had thinned into something quieter but not weaker. What had once been an emergency was now a condition of life near the forest. The gorilla was rarely spoken of directly. When she was, it was in lowered voices and indirect language. People said the deep north, or simply, past the trees. A school register from that year shows attendance drops during late autumn, especially among families living closest to the woodland edge. No reason is recorded. A teacher later remarked that children had become alert in a way children shouldn't have to be, flinching at sounds adults barely noticed. Occasionally, physical evidence surfaced that reignited unease. A hunter found a deer carcass laid carefully beside a creek, untouched except for a single broken limb. The meat was not consumed. Another man discovered claw marks scored into the trunk of a cypress tree, high above his head, deliberate and evenly spaced. These were not the actions of hunger. They suggested control. Medical discussion had long since ended, but one retired physician offered a final observation to a colleague. He said the injections administered during pregnancy may have disrupted not just aggression but bonding. Pain teaches differently, he said, and loss, when combined with stimulation, sharpens memory. The idea took hold quietly, that the gorilla remembered the town not as prey but as the source of harm, that her restraint was intentional. Late that year, a group of men attempted to map a new logging route through the forest. They abandoned the effort after tools went missing and tents were found collapsed without damage. No tracks were seen. The men did not return. The Alabama Black Belt continued to grow around the absence. Fields expanded south. Trade routes shifted west. The forest to the north remained intact, as if protected by something no one named. By then, the gorilla had become less a creature than a boundary, one defined not by fences but by behavior. She had learned where humans stopped, and she had learned how to stay just beyond that line. By the late 1880s, the gorilla had not been seen clearly in years, yet her influence remained unmistakable. The forest north of town grew denser, not from natural growth alone but from neglect. Logging companies marked the area as low priority. Surveyors redirected their work. Even hunters, who once prided themselves on reaching places others would not, stopped short of the ridgeline as if by instinct. Occasionally, someone new to the area would ask why the land remained untouched. The answers were never detailed. "It doesn't give back," was one response recorded in a local notebook. Another simply said, "It's already taken." What lingered most strongly was the sense that the gorilla had learned to coexist without submission. Signs suggested she understood tools, spacing, and timing. Fires built at the forest edge were extinguished overnight, not scattered or destroyed, but smothered with dirt and leaves. Food left out vanished without disturbance. These acts were not aggressive. They were corrective. A traveling naturalist passing through the Alabama Black Belt in 1888 noted in his journal that the northern woods showed patterns inconsistent with feral habitation. He did not elaborate, only remarking that something there appeared to manage its environment rather than merely survive it. His entry ends abruptly. He never published his findings. As memory of the original escape faded, A new explanation began to circulate quietly, that the gorilla had not fled blindly into the forest, but had chosen it. That after captivity, injections, and loss, she had learned where humans ended and how to remain beyond their reach. In this version of the story, the town was not spared by chance, but by decision. Children raised near the boundary learned the rules without being taught. Do not shout into the trees. Do not follow sounds. Do not leave tools unattended. These instructions carried no fear, only seriousness. The Alabama black belt absorbed this new reality as it had absorbed so many others, without documentation, without ceremony. The gorilla became part of the landscape, not as a legend, but as a condition, something that shaped behavior simply by being remembered. And though no one had seen her clearly in years, no one believed she was gone. By the early 1890s, the forest north of town had become one of the few remaining stretches of uninterrupted woodland in that part of the Alabama Black Belt. While other areas were cleared and replanted, this section remained intact, its boundaries respected without legal protection. Maps showed it as usable land, but no one treated it as such. A brief resurgence of interest came in 1892 when a timber company from outside the region sent an agent to assess the area. His report, later summarized in company correspondence, notes unusual resistance from locals and conditions not favorable to sustained operations. No environmental cause is cited. The company withdrew within weeks. Around this time, new accounts emerged, less about sightings and more about absence. People spoke of the forest as empty, yet alive. Birds avoided certain clearings. Wind moved through the trees unevenly, as if diverted. One farmer said it felt like walking through a room someone just left. The gorilla, if she still lived, had learned how not to be found. One night in late summer, a fire broke out at the edge of the forest, likely started by lightning. It spread quickly through dry brush before stopping abruptly at an invisible line, leaving the deeper woods untouched. Those who saw the aftermath remarked on how sharply the burn ended, as if checked. No explanation satisfied them. Medical men no longer speculated. Naturalists no longer visited. The story had moved beyond professional interest and into lived understanding. What had begun with injections and confinement had ended in something neither scientific nor entirely natural. Children born in that decade grew up hearing fragments, never the full account. They were told that something had gone wrong long before they were born and that the land remembered it. That was enough. By the close of the decade, the gorilla had become inseparable from the forest itself. Not a creature hiding within it, but a presence that shaped how it was treated. She did not need to appear. Her absence was more instructive than any sighting. And in the Alabama Black Belt, where restraint often outlasted explanation, that quiet understanding held firm. By the mid-1890s, the story had crossed a threshold. It was no longer something remembered by witnesses, but something inherited by those who had never seen the gorilla at all. The original events, her purchase, the injections, the escape, were now known only in fragments, passed along carefully, stripped of excess detail. What remained was instruction rather than narrative. A county school inspector noted in 1895 that children living near the northern woods showed an unusual awareness of environmental boundaries. The phrase appears clinical, but the meaning was simple. They knew where not to go. They learned it early without being frightened into it. When asked why certain paths ended abruptly, they answered, "That's far enough." Occasionally, someone tried to challenge this understanding. A group of young men from a neighboring county attempted to camp in the forest one autumn night. They returned before dawn, pale and shaken, claiming nothing had happened, only that they felt pressed outward, as if the space itself rejected them. They refused to speak further. None went back. The gorilla herself was no longer described as aggressive. In fact, many now insisted she had never been violent by nature at all. The blame shifted, quietly but firmly, to the injections and the man who ordered them. Edwin Harrowell's name, when spoken, carried a tone of finality. He was remembered not with anger, but with a kind of distant caution, as someone who crossed a line without understanding what lay beyond it. A traveling physician writing in 1897 included a brief, careful reference in a private letter. He speculated that prolonged chemical stimulation during pregnancy could result in heightened perception, memory fixation, and avoidance-based survival behavior. "The creature," he wrote, "may have learned us too well." The letter was never published. By then, sightings had become almost non-existent. What persisted instead were signs of order, camps left intact but rearranged. Tools moved from open ground to sheltered places. Once, a broken fence was found repaired crudely with branches and vines, strong enough to hold livestock. No one claimed responsibility. The Alabama Black Belt had long been shaped by unspoken agreements between people and land. This was simply another, though more unsettling, example. The forest remained untouched, not because it was dangerous, but because it had been claimed in a way no one wished to contest. And somewhere within it, whether living still or not, the consequence of those early injections endured. Not as rage, not as revenge, but as a quiet intelligence that understood what humans were capable of and chose distance over destruction. By the turn of the century, the northern forest had become fixed in the collective map of the region, not as wilderness to be conquered, but as space already spoken for. New roads curved away from it. Property lines were drawn with subtle adjustments. Even postal routes avoided passing too close. None of this was mandated. It was simply how things were done. An agricultural survey conducted in 1901 noted the land's fertility and timber potential, then added a brief recommendation: deferred due to local conditions. No further explanation appears. The surveyor did not return. What little discussion remained had shifted away from fear and toward responsibility. Elders spoke of the gorilla not as a monster, but as a result, a living consequence of interference carried out without restraint or care. The injections, once mentioned only in whispers, were now cited openly in these quiet conversations, always as a mistake. "She was changed before she ever escaped," one man said. "The forest just finished what we started." No one attempted to hunt her. No traps were set. In fact, deliberate efforts were made to avoid provoking attention. Food stores were secured. Livestock were penned closer to town. People learned over time what behaviors reduced disturbances. The arrangement held. Occasionally, something would remind them that the boundary still existed. A sudden silence in the woods. A path found freshly cleared, only to close again overnight. Once, A lantern left hanging near the tree line was discovered the next morning, placed gently on the ground, unbroken. These incidents were discussed briefly, then set aside. Naturalists passing through the Alabama Black Belt remarked on the unusual preservation of that forest section, calling it accidentally protected. They attributed it to economics or terrain. Locals did not correct them. By 1910, nearly 3 decades had passed since the escape. Whether the gorilla still lived was no longer the central question. What mattered was that something shaped by captivity, loss, and chemical interference had altered how the land was used, and that alteration had endured. The forest remained intact. The town remained cautious. And the lesson, though never written, remained clear. Some actions do not end when control is lost. They continue quietly in the spaces left behind. As the years moved deeper into the early 20th century, the story entered its final phase, not of events but of inheritance. Those who had witnessed the escape firsthand were now elderly or gone, yet the rules remained. The forest boundary was still respected. The land north of town was still avoided, not out of fear, but out of recognition. A county school book printed in 1912 included a simple map of the region. Students later noticed that the northern woods were left unshaded, an omission not explained in the text. When a teacher was asked why, she reportedly said, "Some places are better learned without ink." The comment was remembered long after the lesson itself faded. There were no confirmed sightings of the gorilla in these later years. If she lived, she did so beyond observation. If she had died, whatever order she established remained intact. Camps placed too near the forest were found subtly altered. Footpaths closed on their own. The woods resisted intrusion without violence. Occasionally, someone new to the area would ask directly if the stories were true. The answers were always careful. Yes, an animal had been brought there. Yes, mistakes had been made. No, it had never been taken back. That was the extent of it. Medical understanding had advanced by then, enough that some physicians quietly revisited the case in private discussion. They spoke of trauma compounded by chemical interference, of maternal loss reshaping behavior, of intelligence sharpened under stress. None of this was written formally. There was no case file to attach it to. By 1920, the town had fully grown around the absence. Children born that year would grow up never knowing the forest as neutral ground. They would inherit the boundary the same way they inherited property lines or family names. The Alabama Black Belt had seen many such quiet legacies, outcomes shaped not by singular catastrophe but by sustained restraint. This was one of them, a consequence that did not demand attention, only respect. And so the story neared its end not with discovery but with acceptance. Whatever had gone wrong in 1882 had not been undone. It had settled. And the land, shaped by that settlement, continued to hold its silence. The final references to the forest appear not as warnings, but as confirmations that nothing had changed. A 1929 county land review lists the northern tract among parcels left as is, a phrase repeated without commentary. No effort was made to reclaim it. No proposal suggested otherwise. The decision required no justification. By then, nearly 50 years had passed since the gorilla was brought into the Alabama Black Belt. The man who ordered the injections was gone. The town that panicked had grown and steadied, and the animal, whether still living or long since returned to the soil, had left something behind that did not depend on her presence to persist. Those who passed near the boundary in later years spoke of a familiar sensation. Not fear, not threat, only awareness. A sense that the land noticed movement, that it responded not with force but with quiet correction. Paths curved, sounds softened. People felt the urge to turn back without knowing why. No one ever proved the gorilla survived into those years. No remains were found. No final sighting recorded. Yet no one claimed the forest back either. The outcome of the injections, the captivity, the premature loss, all of it seemed to have settled into the land itself, shaping how it was treated long after the original cause had faded from memory. The Alabama Black Belt is full of places like this, fields avoided, woods left standing, boundaries drawn without explanation. Most stories attached to them are forgotten. This one endured, not because it was told loudly, but because it was lived with carefully. Something was brought there in 1882. Something was changed by human hands, and when it escaped, it did not seek revenge. It sought distance. In doing so, it taught an entire region how to step back. Even now, those who know the land say the forest remains quiet in a particular way. Not empty, not abandoned, simply settled. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part, that whatever went wrong was never corrected, only absorbed, leaving behind a silence that still holds its shape in the Alabama Black Belt.